Hey guys, tonight we're starting with one of the strangest and scariest pandemics in human history, the Black Death. A 14th century tragedy fueled by poor hygiene, bad medical advice, fleas, and a little bit of sloppiness. Tonight the question is, what would you do to survive the disaster? And no, don't get sick. Doesn't count. Before we get started, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you live. It's always fun to see people from all over the world participating. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some pleasant background noise, and relax into the evening. Let's start with the first, and perhaps most important, decision of your life. Where do you live, if you answered? In the middle of a bustling 14th century city, full of opportunity and culture. Then, congratulations, you're about 85% dead. The cities of that era were nothing like the romantic pictures in history books. They were densely populated, hardly anyone bathed, and everyone happily threw their trash outside their doors. Imagine thousands of people crammed into small wooden houses, with no sewers, no running water, and rats so comfortable they might have rented their rooms. Centers like London, Paris, and Florence were open buffets for the plague, narrow streets, exposed gutters, and even livestock kept indoors. Cities are ideal places for bacteria, fleas, and stench to thrive. If the airborne germs don't kill you, the mental shock of the smell will be enough to knock you out. You don't have to be sick to be dangerous. Just being near someone who is sick is enough. Now look at the countryside. Yes, there's isolation, harsh weather, and the occasional pesky goose, but you have space. Fewer people, fewer crowds, and especially fewer rats. If you live on a small farm, or a sleepy village in the hills, where your nearest neighbor is a few goats away, your chances of survival are much higher. Even better were remote monasteries. Some orders, like the Carthusians, lived in near total silence and isolation. They didn't mean to create a quarantine zone, but they did it accidentally. In short, if you valued your lungs and blood, in 1348 the best way to live was to stay as far away from people as possible. Cancel meetings, leave the market early, and if someone said, "It can't be that bad," that was your cue to put on your cloak and disappear from the city. Imagine, it's 1349, someone sneezes in your direction. Would you A. politely ask if they're okay? B. offer them a clove of garlic? C. run like hell? The correct answer is C. Run as far away as possible. Back then, no one knew what a virus was. But one thing was understood. If anyone near you started coughing, had a fever, or was bleeding where it shouldn't have, it was time to retreat. Social distancing didn't have a name, but survivors practiced it naturally. It was believed that the disease was spread through poisonous air, called miasma, though in reality, fleas were the culprit. But avoiding other people was unintentionally the best advice. Those who left the city early, went to the countryside, and hid in their homes, were often the ones who survived. Whole families could survive just by closing their doors for a year. Is it stressful? A lot. When your cousin knocks on the door, sneezes through the keyhole, and asks for a bowl of soup, turning him down definitely makes you feel guilty. But if you let him in, your whole family will probably die before Sunday. So sorry, Gregory, no soup. Some aristocratic families were even more prescient. They left the city as soon as they heard of the plague. The famous Boccaccio family fled Florence, taking wine, poetry, and aristocratic social distance with them. Meanwhile, the poor learned quarantine, by trial and error, mostly by error. Markets, festivals, weddings, all are a gamble with death. If you stay home and talk to your cat instead of your neighbor, your chances of survival skyrocket. It's as simple as that. Every handshake can be a death sentence. The medievals didn't have the slogan, flatten the curve, but they understood fewer handshakes equals more birthdays. If you survived, it was certainly not because of fashion. The nobility favored long cloaks, fur sleeves, thick layers of fabric, all a flea's paradise. More fabric, more parasites. Meanwhile, the simple people, wearing little, tight sleeves, linen, had the advantage. Fabrics that fleas weren't very fond of. Some even burned their clothes, thinking that the disease was carried by them, and strangely enough, they weren't entirely wrong. In other words, a luxurious velvet robe can be synonymous with a mobile coffin. And perfume, charms, or rosemary? No use, unless you want people to stay away because of the strong smell. And if you're wondering about the armor, no, it didn't save anyone either. Dying in shiny armor because you refused to take off your gloves to wash your hands. That's a memorable ending. If you want to survive, go high. The air is fresh, there are few people, and rats hate hills. The cold high altitudes make it difficult for fleas to breed, and the steady breeze keeps the air circulating. Even if miasma isn't real, it's always a good idea to stay away from the stinking place. In short, altitude plus isolation equals survival. What about bathing? The medievals believed that hot water opened your pores, making you more susceptible to disease, so they stopped bathing. In fact, it was their filth that made them flea feasts. Those who continued to wash their faces and hands out of superstition, not science, were unwittingly protecting themselves. Some bathed in wine, vinegar, or herbs, not effective, but at least they smelled better than others. And the doctors of that time? They were kind, but they lacked knowledge. They believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The cure? Bloodletting. Lots of blood. So if you coughed up blood, they would take more of your blood, thinking they were treating you. Doctors wore beaked masks, stuffed with flowers and herbs, as PP in the Middle Ages. They believed the scent would ward off the poisonous gases. In reality, it only prevented them from smelling the corpses. They used sticks to keep their distance, sometimes to push patients into mass graves. Treatments? Rub onions under your armpits, drink crushed gems, wear dried toadstools around your neck, or sit in a smoke-filled room. Yes, that's 14th century medicine. And if you survive all that, maybe you deserve it. If a treatment in the 14th century sounded ridiculous, painful, or likely to explode, there was a fair chance someone had prescribed it. Curiously, the people who managed best during the Black Death were often those who avoided professional help entirely: nuns, midwives, and herbalists who quietly relied on calm, cleanliness, and common sense. When the world turned into one large, outdoor morgue, and doctors were recommending onions for everything short of decapitation, one group outperformed everyone else: monks. But not the wandering, sermon in the market square type. We're talking about the silent, stay-at-home variety, the Carthusians, whose vows of isolation would have made a modern health official weep with pride. Their secret wasn't divine protection, it was logistics. Monasteries tended to be remote, perched on hillsides, tucked into forests, built for prayer, not parties. They followed strict routines, regular meals, structured hygiene by medieval standards, and a distinct lack of hugging. No shared spoons, no casual hand-holding, and certainly no communal bathhouses doubling as social mixers. They grew their own food, stored their grain, and avoided city markets humming with rats and regret. Celibacy also turned out to be a practical advantage. Fewer reasons to visit plague-ridden taverns. Of course, not all monks survived. Some bravely ventured into cities to care for the sick, An act of mercy history admires and statistics do not. Traveling clergy endured the worst odds, exposure to death on every doorstep, and the moral impossibility of retreat. The successful monastic strategy was simple: join early, stay put, and decline every mission. But you didn't need a robe or Latin hymns to borrow their wisdom. Isolation, self-sufficiency, and limited contact worked for anyone. Those who lived off the land, blacksmiths, bakers, shepherds, millers, had an advantage. Their work involved heat, grain, or livestock, not crowds. Even grave diggers, morbid as it sounds, were safer than most. They had tools, distance, and the rare wisdom not to touch anything with their faces. And then there were the hermits, the antisocial goat herders, the cobblers who simply stopped answering the door. Once mocked for avoiding people, they became unlikely trendsetters in pandemic survival. The real enemies weren't just human. They were small, whiskered, and fond of your pantry. Rats were the uncredited main characters of the Black Death. They carried fleas, and the fleas carried death. The best defense was simple: raise your food off the floor. Bread under the bed or grain in open bins? That was an invitation to the apocalypse. Smarter households suspended food in jars and boxes from their ceilings, inventing the medieval equivalent of pest-proof storage. Cats, of course, were the unsung heroes. More cats meant fewer rats. Unfortunately, superstition wasn't on their side. Some towns killed them, mistaking them for witches' familiars. The result? More rats, more fleas, and far fewer survivors. And then there was the matter of waste. Tossing scraps from the window or piling garbage by your home made you the host of an unintended rat convention. The clever moved their trash far away, ideally into someone else's yard. Still, the human response to disaster rarely improves with panic. In plague-struck Europe, fear turned neighbors into suspects. Outsiders, minorities, anyone different, all accused of poisoning wells or angering God. Mobs gathered, shouting, burning, and helpfully spreading more bacteria while solving nothing. Those who survived were often the ones who didn't join in, who stayed quiet, locked their doors, and boiled water instead of torches. Panic, after all, travels faster than any plague. Among all the dubious remedies, one humble hero stood out: garlic. People ate it, wore it, hung it, and swore by it. It didn't cure the plague, but it did something better. It gave them hope and perhaps a faint layer of flea resistance. Science now admits garlic has mild antibacterial properties. Medieval science, however, just liked the smell. Garlic wasn't alone in the war on foul air. Flowers, herbs, and little posies of lavender or mint were carried everywhere. They didn't protect anyone from Yersinia pestis, but they made existence slightly more bearable. If you could still smell roses instead of rot, you were probably still alive. These nosegays were the original scented masks, small bouquets clutched close, both a comfort and a statement. I'm trying. Those who could afford such luxuries often lived cleaner and more isolated lives anyway, so the flowers became a symbol of both class and caution. In the end, the Black Death wasn't just a test of immunity, it was a test of restraint. Every handshake, hug, and shared mug was a gamble. The true survivors were those who politely declined every invitation, stayed home, and mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing, quietly, patiently, and alive. Most people who survived the medieval plague didn't do so through brilliance or bravery. They simply stayed home. They minded their business, avoided people, and refused every invitation that sounded remotely social. The quiet ones thrived. That neighbor who always said, "Maybe later," and never came by, still alive. The couple who skipped every feast and festival, also alive. The man who muttered to his chickens and smelled faintly of turnips, alive, if slightly unnerving. The math was simple. More friends meant more chances for the plague to visit. Even kindness was dangerous. Offering bread to a coughing neighbor? Risky. Visiting your aunt? Reckless. Group prayers? Spiritually uplifting, biologically suicidal. The safest homes were quiet ones, families eating apart, talking across rooms, or, when things got serious, across separate houses. If someone sneezed, that was the medieval equivalent of being unfriended permanently. Not out of cruelty, just good epidemiology, before the word existed. Monasteries and noble estates practiced early quarantine. 2.1 sneeze, and you were off to a new wing, which was usually a barn. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the living alive a little longer. Still, no one likes to admit how much of survival came down to luck. You could be clean, cautious, and deeply antisocial, and one enthusiastic flea could still ruin everything. But statistically, the duller your life, the better your odds. Because excitement in the 14th century usually involved travel, laughter, and imminent death. The extroverts, the wanderers, the just popping into town crowd, well, they popped into town and never popped back out. The survivors leaned into monotony. Routine meant safety. Safety meant fewer funerals, particularly your own. Some people, scientists now think, carried rare genetic mutations, like the CCR5 delta 3-2 gene, that made them more resistant. They didn't know it, of course. They just thought, strange. I'm not bleeding from my armpits yet. So, if you were lucky, solitary, fond of boiling water, and owned a cat you actually liked, congratulations. You were medieval royalty, at least in survival statistics. But if you got adventurous, moved to a new city, attended a parade, or drank from a communal cup, you were already writing your own obituary. The plague didn't reward bravery. It rewarded boredom. And if you made it through the fevers, the fear, and the smell, you faced one last duty: to be remembered. Because survival wasn't just about living. It was about leaving proof you'd done it. Enter the scribes, monks, and tired villagers with good memories and access to ink. They wrote. They chronicled. Giovanni Boccaccio turned survival into art with the Decameron, where rich Florentines fled the city to tell stories in the countryside. A monk in Yorkshire wrote only. A great pestilence came, and many died. Concise. Accurate. Unimpressed. Writing was therapy before therapy existed. It helped make sense of loss, and, let's be honest, it was also a subtle way to brag that you were still breathing. Those survivors became our historians. By recording their days, they turned endurance into legacy. But you had to live long enough to write it down. Many didn't. They celebrated too soon, reunited too eagerly, toasted too publicly, and died in the encore. So the true survivors waited. They stayed dull. They declined every hug. They kept their diaries close and their windows closed. And when the world finally quieted, they wrote. Some stories vanished in dust. Others survived for centuries. Each one whispered the same truth: surviving is remarkable. But surviving and documenting it, that's eternal. Long before psychiatry had a name, people tried to explain the unexplainable. If someone spoke to invisible friends or shouted at walls, it wasn't an illness. It was a message from something divine, or something dark. In ancient Mesopotamia, madness meant possession. A restless spirit had moved in, and priests, not doctors, were called to evict it. They used chants, incense, and ritual, all aimed at persuading the demon to leave quietly. Egypt followed suit. The Ebers papyrus blended medicine and mysticism. A woman who cried for no reason might have a wandering womb. A man who forgot his name might be cursed. The cure was purification, perfume, and prayer. The Greeks complicated things further. Homer blamed the gods, divine interference disguised as insanity. Ajax slaughtering sheep in a delusion wasn't sick. just chosen for tragedy. Plato called madness a gift from the gods, the source of poetry and prophecy. Some inspiration, some affliction, both divine. Then came Hippocrates. Tired of spirits, he blamed chemistry. Too much black bile, he said, caused melancholy. His treatment? Diet, rest, and balance. Not perfect, but refreshingly sane for 460 BC. This tug-of-war between sacred and scientific lasted for centuries. One person's prophet was another's lunatic. A healer could be a priest, or a scientist, depending on the century. By medieval times, the church had taken charge. Madness became sin. If you heard voices, it wasn't an imbalance. It was the devil whispering. Confession, flogging, and prayer replaced medicine. Hospitals existed, but they weren't what you'd call hospitable. The poor wandered. The wealthy hid. The rest were chained, sometimes publicly, so passers-by could gawk for fun. London's Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, was one of the first institutions. It quickly became a sideshow. Visitors paid to watch the lunatics. Treatments included bleeding, purging, and ice baths. The logic: drive out the demon by making the body miserable enough to quit. Yet not all corners of the world were cruel. In the Islamic world, Avicenna and his peers still believed in balance, not punishment. In Moorish Spain, hospitals offered gardens, music, and gentle care. But across Christendom, mercy was scarce. Madness was feared, mocked, or burned out. You didn't recover. You repented. You didn't heal. It would take centuries before compassion re-entered the conversation. For most, the Age of Madness was just another chapter in humanity's long, uneasy effort to understand itself. And like all things medieval, it began not with reason, but with fear. As the old texts of Greece and Rome resurfaced, so too did their ideas about medicine. The church's grasp on the body loosened, just slightly, and for a moment, madness was allowed to have flesh again, not just sin. Physicians began to trade demons for humors, angels for anatomy. Words like melancholia, mania, and hysteria drifted back into polite conversation. In theory, the cure was gentler now. A balanced diet, fresh air, calm surroundings. In practice, well, bloodletting and vomiting remained. Fashionably medical. Even astrology made a small comeback. If your moods were erratic, perhaps Saturn was in a bad mood too. But don't mistake that for kindness. The Renaissance adored order, and anything disorderly, especially the mind, was still something to be cleansed. Across Italy and France, asylums began to multiply, not to comfort the suffering, but to quarantine them from society. One voice, however, stood out: Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician who whispered the unthinkable, that so-called witches might simply be women in pain, not servants of the devil. He wrote about demons not to glorify them, but to argue against the burning of the broken. The church disagreed. His books vanished, and his mercy went out of print. Meanwhile, madness remained politically useful. An inconvenient wife, a troublesome daughter, a rival with opinions. Anyone could be declared insane and quietly disappeared behind locked doors. No scandal, just diagnosis. And yet, in art, madness bloomed. Ophelia's drowning grief, Don Quixote's chivalric delusion. The mad became tragic, poetic, even romantic. The world admired their beauty, but still refused to help them. The Enlightenment promised reason. It promised light, and for a while, it almost delivered. Possession lost its credibility, replaced by Latin words and white coats. Asylums turned from rare curiosities into booming industries. Grand buildings rose outside London, Paris, and Vienna, monuments to isolation. They smelled of neglect. They looked like progress. And they were designed not for healing, but for hiding. Philippe Pinel famously unchained the inmates at Bicêtre in 1793. a gesture celebrated as the birth of compassion. Symbolic, yes, but the lock stayed. Patients endured ice baths, force feeding, and moral therapy, a stern lecture on virtue from a man with a stick. Moral treatment. They called it if madness were laziness, and discipline the cure. No shouting. No rebellion. No questions. Routine was medicine. Obedience. Recovery. A few tried differently. At York Retreat in England, the Quakers planted gardens, not chains. They treated patients with silence and respect. A small light, flickering against the dark. Doctors began taking notes. Symptoms, habits, responses. Paperwork, perhaps, but it was progress. Psychiatry was beginning to sound like a science, even if it still behaved like guesswork. The Enlightenment lifted the curse of demons and replaced it with data. Less mystical, yes, but not yet humane. Then came the Victorians. An age of lace, restraint, and contradiction. A society terrified of cracks in its porcelain facade. For women, that crack had a name: hysteria, from the Greek for uterus. It conveniently explained everything men disliked. Sadness? Hysteria? Anger? Hysteria? Ambition? Definitely hysteria. Treatment ranged from absurd to cruel. Some doctors prescribed marriage. Others prescribed electricity. Doctor. Where Mitchell locked women in bed for weeks. No books, no conversation, no writing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman nearly lost her mind to that. Cure. Then she wrote the yellow wallpaper to warn the rest of us. In Paris, Dr. Charcot performed hysteria on stage. Women hypnotized, convulsing, trembling before applauding crowds. Science as theater. A young man named Freud took notes. He would build an empire from them. By the late 1800s, asylums had become cities of silence. Walled gardens, endless corridors, forgotten names. Rebels, widows, veterans, anyone inconvenient could be admitted with a single signature. Leaving required more than sanity. It required luck. Families hid the truth. Obituaries skipped the details. Madness was a stain on reputation. The asylum became the broom closet of the age, where society swept away what it feared most. And yet, history had one more turn to make. The 20th century arrived with trenches, wire, and artillery. And suddenly, madness was everywhere. Men came home shaking, screaming, broken by the unseen. They called it shell shock. At first, doctors blamed the explosions. Then they realized the mind itself could break. War taught psychiatry empathy. Slowly, painfully. A few doctors, like Rivers at Craiglockhart, listened instead of restrained. He treated poet Siegfried Sassoon not with chains, but conversation. And that simple act changed everything. For the first time, madness was not sin or weakness. It was a wound. But progress came with new horrors. In the 1930s, Antonio Moniz invented the lobotomy, a tidy way to silence distress with a scalpel. Walter Freeman later refined it with an ice pick and a hammer. It was cheap, fast, and devastating. Tens of thousands lost pieces of themselves in the name of calm. Then came the electricity, electroconvulsive therapy. Today, it's refined and controlled. Back then, it was anything but. No anesthesia, no consent, just voltage and hope. For some, it brought relief. For many, only confusion. This was the golden age of intervention. Insulin comas, ice baths, isolation. Doctors pulling every lever they could find on the machine of the mind. The Enlightenment had promised reason. The Victorians demanded order. And the modern age delivered power, without mercy. Compassion quietly stepped aside, and control took the stage. The great asylums kept growing, now under the polished banners of state psychiatry. Millions were confined, some for years, some for lifetimes, their names fading from memory like ink in the rain. Ordinary people feared these places. Rumors of cruelty, neglect, and locked doors began to leak through tabloids and horror films. In popular imagination, the mad became villains, the deranged killer, the mad scientist, the escapee in the night. Science had promised reason. What it often delivered was tragedy. But by the 1960s, something shifted. A quiet realization began to take hold. Perhaps it wasn't the patients who were broken. Perhaps it was the system. Public trust in asylums eroded fast. Journalists exposed filthy wards and overmedicated ghosts pacing hospital halls. Lawmakers began to wonder if treatment had simply become a polite word for exile. Thus began deinstitutionalization, a movement powered by new drugs, civil rights, and inevitably, government budgets. The idea was almost poetic: close the walls and open the world. Antipsychotic medications like Thorazine, introduced in the 1950s, made it possible, at least theoretically, for people with schizophrenia or other severe illness to live outside hospital gates. President John F. Kennedy, shaped by his sister's tragic lobotomy, championed the cause. In 1963, he signed legislation funding hundreds of community mental health centers, places meant to offer therapy, housing, and dignity. Freedom with support, that was the dream. But dreams need scaffolding, and the scaffolding never came. The great asylums emptied, but the new clinics were underfunded, unfinished, or simply non-existent. Patients walked out into freedom and found streets instead of homes. Families were unprepared. Police were unequipped. The responsibility shifted from doctors to shelters, from nurses to jailers. Homelessness rose. So did incarceration. Deinstitutionalization wasn't failure. It was unfinished compassion. A good idea, abandoned halfway down the road. It taught a bitter truth. Mercy without structure is just displacement. Still, it changed everything. It forced society to look, really look, at what it had done. It birthed the concept of patient rights, ethical treatment, and the idea that recovery meant more than quiet obedience. But for the poor, the invisible, and the unconnected, the promise of dignity remained. Mostly a promise. Today, the asylum is gone, but misunderstanding has found new architecture. Despite all our progress in neuroscience and psychology, stigma clings like ivy to the walls. We speak more openly about mental health now, but we still flinch at the words themselves. Modern science has mapped the chemistry of sadness, traced the circuitry of fear, and found that trauma leaves fingerprints not just on memory, but on the brain itself. Genetics, childhood, diet, and environment all intertwine. A fragile ecosystem we are only beginning to understand. But understanding doesn't always lead to empathy. Social media gave mental health a spotlight. Hashtags, self-help apps, guided meditations, therapy memes. Famous people talk openly about medication and burnout. And yet, real care remains a luxury. Rural clinics close. Low-income patients wait months. Many are still treated as brief appointments, not human beings. Therapy is no longer taboo. It's a billion-dollar brand. But the same ghosts linger on the sidewalks and behind cell bars. The largest mental health institutions today are not hospitals. They are prisons. Emergency rooms overflow with crises they were never built to handle. We've torn down the asylums but forgotten to build what was promised to replace them. Still, there is movement. Trauma-informed care. Peer support networks. Schools teaching emotional literacy. Neurodiversity reframing difference as identity, not defect. Therapy, once whispered, now spoken aloud at dinner tables. But the story isn't finished. Mental illness may no longer be chained or cut from the skull, but silence still binds many as tightly as any restraint. History has already shown us what not to do. The question now is whether we've learned enough to finally do better. And somewhere far from padded cells and protest signs, another code was being written, one of loyalty, courage, and death with dignity. It wasn't Western medicine but Eastern honor, Bushido, the way of the warrior. Not law, not scripture, just a rhythm of duty and restraint, carried through centuries in whispers, ink, and steel. It spoke of 7 virtues: loyalty, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and rectitude. Ideals not to be admired, but to be lived. A samurai who broke them faced exile, or a quieter, bloodier atonement. Loyalty was sacred. A warrior could betray his body, but never his lord. To fail meant dishonor, and to cleanse dishonor meant seppuku, a blade drawn not in battle, but upon oneself. A second, the kaishakunin, stood ready behind, to end the suffering with precision and grace. To outsiders it seemed barbaric. To the samurai, it was poetry. A death that restored balance. Even after swords were sheathed and the shogunate dissolved, Bushido endured. In classrooms, companies, and quiet hearts. It shaped soldiers in war and workers in peace. Its core lesson remained: the true battle is never against the enemy, it's against oneself. And far to the north, in colder lands, another warrior code burned differently, simpler, rougher, but bound by the same thread of honor. The Vikings didn't write theirs down. They carved it in bone and fire. They believed death comes for all, so better to meet it standing. Blade in hand. To die bravely was to feast in Valhalla. To die afraid was to fade into shadows. Honor was their compass, loyalty to their clan, courage before their gods. They raided not for greed but for glory, for a story worth telling when the mead was poured. And in both East and North, from Kyoto to Kattegat, the lesson was the same: death is inevitable. What matters is how you meet it. Weakness was despised. Vengeance, strangely, was a virtue. If your kin was wronged, if your honor slighted, you were expected to answer with steel, not words. Feuds became family heirlooms, passed down through generations until memory blurred into blood. It wasn't cruelty. It was equilibrium. The old sagas tell of men who refused peace, who declined gold and comfort until justice was done, sword to sword. Even age did not dull the instinct. Some sought one last battle before their bones gave way, choosing pain over obscurity. Because to a Viking, death was not the end. It was a test, a passage into eternity, and only the brave were admitted. To be a Roman soldier was to serve something larger than yourself. Virtus, virtue, courage, manhood, and civic duty were one and the same. A legionnaire wasn't a brawler. He was the empire's arm, disciplined, precise, and obedient. Cowardice erased not just your honor but your name. Sometimes, an entire unit paid the price. One man in 10 executed, the others watching, learning. The Romans built order out of fear, loyalty out of repetition. Training was endless. Disobedience, unthinkable. Victory belonged to Rome, not the individual. Even off the field, the same values ruled: restraint, duty, and composure. A true Roman showed valor not just in battle but in the Senate, in judgment, in self-control. Fides, faithfulness, was sacred. To betray it was to betray civilization itself. And so, they obeyed, endured, conquered, and died as citizens of eternity. In medieval Europe, the sword was baptized. The knight was told to fight, but also to pray. The church called it chivalry, a code meant to civilize killers, to wrap bloodshed in silk. A knight should be brave, loyal, devout, and merciful, especially toward noble ladies and the weak. At least. That was the sermon. In truth, many knights were as ruthless as the wars they fought. Piety on their lips and torches in their hands. Still, the idea mattered. During the Crusades, they were told their swords served heaven. Killing became holy, so long as it was done in God's name. Loyalty was sworn on relics, oaths sealed with faith and fear. Courtly love added a strange poetry, devotion to unattainable women, heroism for their honor. The reality was more pragmatic. Peasants burned, nobles sang. Yet chivalry endured. Turning war into ritual and violence into theater, the knight's sword gleamed not just with blood, but with meaning. In Sparta, there was no poetry, only discipline. Spartan life was war in rehearsal. Boys were inspected at birth. The weak did not survive. The rest were trained, shaped, hardened by the agoge, a relentless system that forged soldiers out of children. They slept rough, starved quietly, spoke little. A Spartan's words were as sharp as his spear, his silence sharper still. Come back with your shield, or on it, mothers told their sons. Courage was not optional. Breaking formation was the ultimate sin, not just a tactical failure, but a moral one. To expose your brothers was to die twice. Sparta worshipped unity, obedience, and the erasure of self. Glory was not personal, it belonged to the phalanx. They did not just fight like weapons, they were weapons. And then came the Mongols, nomads on an endless horizon. Their strength was not numbers, but precision. Under Genghis Khan, loyalty was law, disobedience extinction. Their code was carved by the wind and the steppe. Adapt or die. A Mongol child learned to ride before he could walk, to shoot before he could speak. They could travel for days without fire, live on dried meat, and loose arrows at full gallop. War, for them, was not chaos. It was calculus. The yasa, a code of discipline, bound them all. Loot without order, executed. Disobey, executed. Cowardice, unthinkable. And yet they were not mindless. They mastered strategy and illusion, mercy and terror in equal measure. They spared cities that yielded, erased those that didn't. Birth meant nothing. Merit meant everything. A herdsman could rise through loyalty and skill. For all their ruthlessness, the Mongols were eerily modern, efficient, adaptable, and pragmatic. To them, war was not a question of morality. It was a fact of life, and history remembers facts. Death, to the Mongols, wasn't personal. It was practical. They didn't chase honor like the knights, or purity like the samurai. They chased results, and they almost always caught them. Their code was lean, unsentimental, and devastatingly efficient. It built warriors not of myth or marble, but of flesh, bone, and will. Far to the south, another kind of warrior was being forged, not by legend, but by a man named Shaka. Early 19th century Southern Africa trembled beneath his reforms. He turned scattered Zulu clans into a single heartbeat of war. At its center stood a code of unity, loyalty, and courage that left no room for hesitation. Shaka replaced the throwing spear with the ikoa, a short, stabbing blade meant for close combat. He formed regiments, impi, bound by age, discipline, and shared endurance. They trained, ate, and marched as one body. A warrior could not marry until he proved his courage in battle. To falter was disgrace. To flee was death. Those who stood their ground were rewarded, with cattle, with honor, with memory. Their formation, the buffalo horn, swept across battlefields like a storm. Its center held firm, the flanks curved inward, trapping enemies in a living cage of spears. To face the Zulu army was to face inevitability. Each man knew his place. Each death had purpose. They fought not for empire, but for identity. One people, one pulse, one shield. And when the horns closed, even empires learned fear. Across the Atlantic, among the deserts and red canyons of the American Southwest, another code endured in whispers and silence. The Apache did not fight for crowns or conquest. They fought because survival itself was sacred. Their world was harsh. And so were they. And no kings. No generals. No written law. Only a way of life, taught by experience and endurance. Boys were trained to run barefoot for miles, to bathe in freezing rivers, to bear hunger without complaint. Pain was not punishment, it was rehearsal. They learned to track an enemy from a single footprint, to vanish into cliffs without a sound. Silence was a virtue. Boasting was shameful. The greatest warriors were the quietest ones. The Apache saw cunning as courage. Ambushes were not cowardice, they were intelligence in motion. Every strike was measured, every retreat deliberate. They fought to protect, not to conquer. To guard their families, their land, their balance with the world. Vengeance, when it came, was calm and exact. Even in defeat, they refused surrender. Leaders like Geronimo became symbols of endurance. Outnumbered, exiled, but never broken. To outsiders, they were savages. To themselves, they were keepers of the sacred order. Quiet, precise, unyielding. And in 17th century India, amid empires and oppression, rose a brotherhood that turned faith into armor, the Khalsa. Formed by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699, they were saint soldiers, spiritual in devotion, fearless in defense. Their code was as revolutionary as it was disciplined. First, equality. The Khalsa erased caste, wealth, and birthright. Every initiate took the name Singh. Lion, a prince and a farmer stood side by side, fighting not for conquest, but for justice, for the protection of any soul in need. Second, discipline. They swore to keep 5 symbols, the 5 Ks: uncut hair, a wooden comb, a steel bracelet, short breeches, and a ceremonial sword. Each held meaning, but the sword, Kirpan, was both defense and duty. To be Khalsa was to serve without ego, to fight only when righteousness demanded. Meditation, humility, and charity were as vital as strength. When war came, it was not out of hatred, but necessity. The Khalsa stood against the Mughal Empire, outnumbered but unbroken. Their battle cry was not for glory, but for truth. Betrayal of the code was betrayal of self. To join was to live by a vow, and if needed, to die for it. The Khalsa warrior did not fight for land or kings. He fought to keep the balance between faith and freedom. And in doing so, he carved a legacy that still whispers through time. A promise that courage and compassion can share the same armor. But even the noblest vows are tested. And soon, another war began. This time not for land or faith, but for control. Over the human spirit itself. A quieter crusade. A war not with swords, but with bottles. When the corks finally popped in 1933, America didn't just celebrate the return of liquor, it exhaled a decade of contradiction. The noble experiment, meant to cure the nation of its vices, had instead exposed them, and turned them into art, music, and myth. But Prohibition's ghosts didn't fade with the hangover. The black market syndicates that rose to smuggle whiskey simply pivoted to gambling, narcotics, and racketeering. The modern American mafia was born not from poverty, but from policy. What began as a moral crusade left behind a criminal empire that would outlive every saloon it replaced. Law enforcement learned, too. The chaos of bootleg wars pushed Washington to centralize policing, expand the FBI, and sharpen surveillance. The modern war on crime was built from the ruins of the war on booze. And yet the public learned its own lesson, that legislating morality only breeds defiance. A country that had once preached temperance now distrusted the pulpit of government itself. Prohibition reshaped American identity as much as it reshaped its nightlife. It taught people that rebellion could be stylish, that secrecy could be social, and that defiance could dance. Even now, echoes of that era hum beneath neon lights and barroom jazz. The idea that every rule has a loophole, and every law invites a story. The experiment failed, but the legend endured. And in the end, the age that tried to silence America only taught it how to sing louder.